You're listening to the Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Walklate, and in today's discussion I'm looking at the legacy of the London Olympics. Team GB won 29 gold medals, beaten only by China and the USA. Branded a massive success, they've prompted calls from all sides to make sure that Britain capitalises on the wave of enthusiasm sweeping the nation. But in the light of remarks by the Prime Minister urging state schools to take a lead in promoting sport among the young, we ask, are state school children disadvantaged when it comes to sport? Questions are being asked over whether children are doing enough sport in school. And recently it emerged that the current government has given its approval for the vast majority of applications for the sale of 21 school playing fields. Prime Minister David Cameron has said that £1 billion will be invested in school sports over the next 4 years, but urged teachers to encourage their students to be more competitive in sport and end an all-must-have prizes culture in Britain. A draft new curriculum will be released this autumn, requiring the compulsory participation of primary school students in sports such as football, hockey and netball. Meanwhile, Lord Moynihan, the chairman of the British Olympic Association, said that it was wholly unacceptable that more than half of Team GB's medalists at the Beijing Olympics came from independent schools. Only 7% of children in the country are privately educated. I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Adrian Elliott, a retired head teacher of a state secondary school in York in the north of England, and he's also worked as a school inspector and as an advisor to schools, having written several books on education. And also Mihir Bose, one of Britain's leading sports journalists. And joining us on the phone is John Pettit, a former PE teacher and current director of PE recruitment, and Dr. Jean Key, Chair of the Board of Association for Physical Education. Thank you all for coming. I'd first like to ask you all very briefly, are state school children disadvantaged when it comes to sport? Dr. Adrian Elliott.
I think inevitably they are, because in terms of facilities and the money available, I think there is more money in the average independent school. And obviously the facilities tend to be better. So I think in that sense that there clearly is a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious from the Olympic performances. If you look at Beijing, 50% of Britain's gold medals came from the private sector, which educates 7% of the children in this country. The ratio is slightly better for this. The final figures haven't come out. But, nevertheless, it's quite clear school playing fields have been sold out over many years. And basically, we still have a hangover of the philosophy that was propounded in the late 70s and 80s, which said that competitive sport is a bad thing. And as somebody once said, competitive sport led to the Battle of the Somme. Ridiculous statements like that. So, that hangover, though, while that philosophy, if you like, and this Olympics has proved, nobody would advance that argument now, but that philosophy is gone. The hangover of that, I think, still remains. And of course, it didn't affect the private schools as much as it affected the state schools.
And Dr. Jean Key?
I think we have to look at this in a slightly different way and look at who goes to state school and who goes to private school. Inevitably, children who go to private school, independent schools, are at an advantage in some ways because they will have parents who are very much concerned about their education. That's not to say that state school parents are not concerned, but they probably have a little bit more disposable income, which enables them to engage in lots of different activities outside school, as well as benefiting from the private school system. Already, children who go to state schools might be slightly disadvantaged. I would disagree with Mihir about the competitive element, because I think my experience of training teachers and working with teachers in schools is that they don't have this issue around competitiveness. I think that's a myth that's been built up, and I think we need to move on from that.
I'm afraid it's not a myth. I'm not talking about teachers. I'm talking about the overarching philosophy. Politicians expounded it. I heard it in the 80s. There's documentary evidence that can be produced of what was said by many people about competitive sport and how bad it was. And it's very evident. No, hang on. It's very evident. It's very evident. If you look at Jamaica, a small island of 2.3 million, producing the Hussein Bowls, where do they come from? They come from a state school system. They come from a grassroots school system, which just doesn't exist in this country. And the other example I give is of somebody called Dennis Compton. And he emerged because there was a state school cricket system, which doesn't exist anymore. So, systems have changed in this country. We've got to accept that. This is not a thing about teachers. It's about overarching philosophy of what has happened. We have a club-based system in this country of producing. What we have produced with these games are elite funding for governing bodies at the top level. It doesn't percolate down to the bottom level, and the lines are not drawn up.
Well, we'll come back to that. I'd just like to ask John Pettit, what's your view? Are state school children disadvantaged when it comes to sport?
I think my point of view is that they may be disadvantaged in the fact that the hierarchy of the schools, particularly in independent schools, place a greater importance on competitive sport or sport in general. And I think that greater importance leads to a greater opportunity in many respects. I think we're going backwards since the Conservative government have been in power, and I think that the previous government had, within the school sports partnership system, had injected a lot of cash and created a fantastic system to develop young athletes and create pathways from schools to clubs. And I think that the Conservative government at the moment are taking backward steps. I think we're going back to the 80s and 90s where everything is placed, all this emphasis is placed on competitive sport. There was and there is competitive sport in all schools, in all state schools, and that was encouraged by the school sports partnerships. And the fact that I think there's been criticisms levelled that it was all about participation, and the example used of Indian dance, I think from David Cameron, I think that is unfair. There is opportunities for all pupils to take part in physical activity, and for those that chose, there's opportunities for those to move through the pathways and compete in all manner of sports.
Would you agree with Mihir's comments? And also Mr Cameron, I believe, has also said that there needs to be a more competitive ethos in British schools.
Well, at the moment we've got the competition managers in place, the school games organisers, so there is this competition element. But what we have to take into consideration is we have to have a participation base. We have to have a wide base of participants to create the competition at the apex of this performance triangle, so that they can go through into participation, through from participation into competition. And so the emphasis has to be on mass participation to start off with, so that we can see what's out there, we can see the talent, and we can nurture that talent through to competition. But let's just bear in mind that there's a wider agenda here in terms of obesity, etc. It's very, very important to get all these children actually physically active, and that's where we start, and that's where the route to competition starts.
I totally agree with John. I think that the most important challenge that we have as we move forward and making the most of these games and the enthusiasm and the very positive feeling that we've got from the games is to ensure that children in primary schools and teachers who are teaching these children in primary schools are supported to develop a movement foundation. If they've got that movement foundation, they will be positive about taking part, whether it's competitive elements or whether it's just as participation purely for enjoyment, but they need that very, very important movement foundation base from which we can then develop.
I mean, I don't want to labour this anti-competitive thing, but I don't agree with Mihir. I mean, this is something I researched in some depth for my book, and I couldn't find the evidence for it. Coupled with the fact, my own personal experience, I've been involved in state education for over 40 years, is I've never met a single person who expressed opposition to competitive sport. I've met some people who thought that perhaps there was too much emphasis on it as opposed to widening the participation, too much emphasis on the first 15 in a school and perhaps ignoring the rest. But in terms of an competitive ideology. I've just never met it. But I do agree with what both the other speakers were saying, is that we are talking actually about two different things here. We're talking about the elite athletes, obviously people reaching for gold medals, and then there's the issue of getting as many children involved in playing sport. But I think just one point I would make, figures from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport from last year show that 85% of 10-year-olds and 96% of 15-year-olds were playing sport regularly. Obviously, the vast majority of that is through school. But I think here there is an issue as to how many 20, 21-year-olds are continuing. And that is a key question. Are we giving them the skills and the interest and the motivation to carry on after school? I think that is important.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, are state school children disadvantaged when it comes to sport? I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Adrian Elliott, a retired head teacher of a state secondary school in York in the north of England. And he's also worked as a school inspector and as an advisor to schools, having written several books on education. And Mihir Bose, one of Britain's leading sports journalists. And joining us on the phone is John Pettit, a former PE teacher and current director of PE recruitment, and Dr. Jean Key, chair of the Board of Association for Physical Education. I'd like to ask Mihir, do you feel that possibly the hegemony of football has a part to play? I mean, when I went to a state comprehensive school, and there was a huge emphasis on playing football. You play a bit of rugby, maybe a tiny bit of athletics in the summer. No cricket whatsoever. I actually went to a sports college, and that was the state of play, if you excuse the semi-pun. I wasn't really exposed enough to sport. Do you think that the dominance of football has a part to play in this?
Well, what has changed is this country has gone through an important sporting cultural change. What used to happen is that the FA Cup final would bring the end of the season. I remember as a kid reading books where Don Bradman would come and watch the FA Cup final, motor down to Worcester and score his traditional double hundred, and of course England get beaten in the Ashes and so on. But cricket would come in to play from May right up to around about, there was a sort of crossover season around about now. And you, of course, got double internationals like, very many players. And Dennis Compton wasn't a double international, but played for Arsenal and Middlesex in England and so on. But that has completely changed because football now is an all-year-round sport. In fact, apart from the last 2 weeks here where I never thought I would live to see the day where the Sun's headline would be the history boys about gymnastics on the front page. This is unbelievable what this Olympics has done. But I'm not afraid, I'm quite glad the Premier League season is coming, but with it will come football back again in a few days. And, all this will be pushed to the margins. And that is how this country has changed. Other countries, on the whole, though Australia has not been successful, they have a balance in their various seasons. And I think we have lost that balance. And I cannot see that balance being reversed. So given the media attention on football, it's inevitable even a young girl would want to become a football player rather than any other sport. I mean, that is what they see all the time. That is the emphasis. That is what people talk about, Nowadays, even the Prime Minister is happy to be associated with football. Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't know what a football was, So unless we can change that, and I can't see how that can be changed, how that sort of mental attitude can be changed, you're not going to have the right sort of images in front of you to encourage people to take on something else, say gymnastics or something like that.
Okay. John Pettit?
I'm disappointed that the Premier League season has come around so quickly, particularly having spent 2 marvellous weeks watching the Olympics. But I think if we were to go into schools, I do think the landscape has changed. And since the advent of school sports partnerships from 2000 onwards, the opportunity for pupils to take part in new sports, minority sports, and a whole variety of those can't be ignored. Yet football still is a big sport in schools. It sounds like you went to a school that was unfortunately tied up with that sort of football philosophy, but there are many, many fine examples of schools offering all sorts of opportunities to their pupils.
And Dr. Jean Key?
Wouldn't it be great if the papers and the journalists actually took note of other sports and didn't go back into the football line? Because we've been talking about this, particularly with girls in schools, for a long time. They don't see role models in the papers. The last 2 weeks, they've seen it all. It's been fantastic. You know, I'm sorry that football's coming back into it again, and I like sport. I will watch football as well, but I would like to see a balance in the papers and on the television.
It's very easy to attack journalists, but hang on a second. You can attack me. That's my profession. But which is the highest selling newspaper in this country? The Sun. Why isn't it the Sunday Times? Why isn't it the Times? Why isn't it the Daily Telegraph? Papers I've worked for. Because let's face it, the news media responds to what the public wants, if you like. And I think there's another question which we need to examine, which we forget. The Olympics is the only time something called Team GB exists, because we are a unique sporting country. Having invented sport, we also invented our own international sports, which is 4 nations: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So when it comes to football, when it comes to rugby, when it comes to cricket, even when it comes to hockey, though the hockey people manage it much better than football, there isn't a Team GB anymore. So we talk of Team GB only once in 4 years. And before these games, the British Olympic Association was a very good travel agent, which once in 4 years got them organised, sent them off to the games, and they came back with a few medals, and then we forgot about it. Now, how you can change that is a very complicated process. Our sporting structure is not a blank sheet of paper. It's a whole maze. If you look at our structure of ours in this country, in Britain, it's a whole maze of institutions which is not possible to get an easy line through. People have tried, and I wish them luck trying after the Olympics, but I'm not very hopeful.
I think what was really amusing was the first kind of Team GB event, so to speak, was the women's football match, and watching the 70,000 fans trying to work out exactly what chants they should be chanting was fantastic to watch.
And actually, throughout the Olympics, only chant was Team GB. If you go to a football match, we have some very witty chants. Football can be horrible, but actually the fans, when they get round to it, have some of the wittiest chants in the world. But they couldn't think of anything more witty than Team GB. We sounded like an American audience sounding, come on, USA. There wasn't any of that English wit or British wit coming through.
Dr. Adrian Elliott, there's been all sorts of numbers of, Boris Johnson, the London mayor, has said, it should be 2 hours of sport every single day. There have been, suggestions of bringing back 2 hours a week, after school clubs, lunchtime hours of sport. What would you suggest? What do you think is an adequate amount of sport that a child should be doing?
I wondered if the comment by Boris Johnson was almost a mistake. 2 hours a day within a day school, 10 hours a week, as long as you've got the national curriculum. And in the case of my own school, and I think this would apply to many others, we simply wouldn't have the facilities. It would mean something like 300 or 400 pupils doing sport at the same time. Apart from just sending them to run around the streets of York, we wouldn't have the facilities to provide PE for that many. So I'm not too convinced about the 2 hours a day. I think the 2 hours a week should be a minimum, but I think if you go back to the excellent school sport partnership that John Pettit mentioned, and I do think the abolition by this government is one of the worst educational mistakes it's made. It's made a few. I think if you look at that, it was never intended that would be a maximum, as David Cameron seemed to suggest. That was a minimum in curriculum time, with the assumption that there would be extracurricular time on top of that. And I also wonder, linking in with some of David Cameron's comments about bringing competitive team games into primary schools, whether one's thought that the issues have been thought out there about the number of children in some of the smaller primary schools. I'm the governor of a primary school with a total of 43 children. That's between 5 and 11. Imagine working out team sports for them. So there are issues there. But I think the 2 hours a week was meant to be a minimum in school time, and then extracurricular on top of that.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you're saying, Adrian, is quite true. You can't get that sort of thing, and also we've got to recognise that society has changed. If you talk the older football players, for instance, they will tell you that they learned a lot of playing football on the streets. You don't have that anymore. That has gone out. And there's another factor which we often don't mention, which is also a cultural factor with certain communities. For instance, in the Muslim community, kids after school are encouraged to go to their their religious classes. This is the fact. This is something that that's a cultural, if you like, religious factor which has to be taken into account. So it's a much more complex story than a very simple one. But what we need to do is actually study it properly and see how we can go forward and get a simpler sporting structure. Because at the moment we have UK Sport, we have Sport England, we have all the sports councils in the various home nations and home countries, and the plethora of organisations mean everybody has a vested interest in doing a little bit. And while we have proved that elite funding and elite athletes can work, we've got to show that it works down the line. I mean, state school systems have still produced great athletes. Seb Coe himself, Steve Redgrave. But then Steve Redgrave went and did rowing with the help of his parents, with the Rowing Association and things like that. Now, unless you get that sort of help, without that, you can't produce champions.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. Dr. Jean Key, there's often you'll see on the streets after school, or even during lunchtime, if you're near a school, there are the kids sort of loitering around, not having a lot to do. Do you think that lunchtime and after school clubs are the way to go with this sort of thing?
Not necessarily. I think the most important thing that the government could do would be to reinstate the 2 hours minimum. I agree with Adrian there. I think the next most important thing is to really help the sports clubs to work with schools to build and support the opportunities available for children. What a lot of schools have done now is cut down the lunch times, the amount of time at lunchtime. So they don't get lunchtime clubs really in most schools now, which means that they often will finish early. And then there are all sorts of demands on the children then. And on the teachers. I think earlier on somebody else mentioned this. There are lots of demands on the teachers. So I think one of the most important things really is to get that synergy between school and physical education and the education part, and then linking with the clubs and organisations and local communities that can actually provide opportunities for these children in sport.
John Pettit, you're a former PE teacher. Now, Jeremy Hunt said sometime last week that there's often with teachers, there's an element of luck, with some kids getting an inspirational teacher. Is it often just down to chance?
Well, I'd like to think that the majority of PE teachers working in the system are inspirational. There has to be an element of luck and chance there, I suppose. I did think I took an objection to some of the comments of David Cameron last week when he, I think, openly criticised teachers. And in our experience, the teachers out there, the current crop of PE teachers are extremely committed. They want to run extracurricular programs. They want to develop future athletes and future stars. For me, as an ex-PE teacher, when I was teaching, it was one of the most enjoyable parts of my job was the out-of-school hours activity and running clubs and competitions. And that's not just for elite sportsmen and women. That was for everyone, participation clubs as well as school teams, etc. The biggest concern that I have is the cutting of teacher trainer numbers, the decrease in school budgets, which have led to schools having to take on cover supervisors. And if, for example, a PE teacher is away or ill, the pupils will often go either to a classroom or they'll have an unqualified teacher instructing them during a lesson. So it's putting the emphasis on the quality of the teaching, whether that's inside the curriculum. And I agree with Jean and with Adrian that it has to be a minimum of 2 hours a week, and we were working towards that 5-hour offer during the School Sports Partnerships. We're offering 5 hours of quality activity inside and outside of the curriculum. But ultimately, any offer is only going to be as good as the teacher that's offering it.
Mihir, is it just down to more investment is needed?
No, I think it's what is needed is a strategic planning system. Because let's look at it. There are only 2 examples in the world of successful sports education. There is what is the Soviet model, which the Chinese have basically adopted, which is you take somebody From the age of 4 or 5, if you pick somebody, take them away from their family, train them at special schools. Now, in our democratic system, that totalitarian system just wouldn't work. Or there is the United States example, which is a system where you give special scholarships and so on to students, so they go through a college-based system. But then the United States, in terms of sport, is actually an isolated country, because most of the sports they play, the rest of the world don't play. We used to have, in the dim past, a system where the schools and the colleges would be integrated, admittedly, at the private school, at the Oxbridge level. So you had the Colin Cowdreys of this world making their debut for England while there were still students and so on. Now that system has gone. So we need a replacement system which takes in the state school system and builds up through it.
Dr. Adrian Elliott, would you agree with that?
I'd agree with the strategy, but I think as the other two of the other speakers have mentioned, we were getting that with the school sports partnership, because I think one of the things we haven't mentioned today is primary schools and primary education. And I think what the school sports partnership did extremely successfully was bring together secondary schools and primary schools in a partnership. And I think if that could be reinstated. At the same time, I don't think we must lose sight of the fact. I take Mihir's points about the days of Colin Cowdrey and Dennis Compton and so on. But between 1948 and 1976, in 8 Olympic Games, we won a total of 28 gold medals. Just won 29 in the last one.
But that's because lottery money has come in and there has been elite level funding. We have targeted elite level funding in a way that was never done before.
I think also part of that medal count was an influx of extra sports that have come in the past 40 years or so as well. But it's all relative. No, I take your point.
It is, but it's a heck of a difference. Given that we won 19 at Beijing as well, that's
but we started off from a low base of 1 gold in Atlanta, and then that was 96, just as lottery money was coming in. And that when we targeted governing bodies and said, we'll give you this money if you win this sort of medals. That's the first time in British sporting history that was done.
Dr. Jean Key, we're running out of time, but do you agree with me here about restructuring of the system?
Yeah, I definitely think there's something to be done there. We need to look at the position overall. We can't ignore I've already said this once, the very basics, and somehow that needs to be linked in with provision that's not just in school. So education, sport, leisure, the whole thing needs to be looked at properly, and an investment in grassroots physical education, making sure that we have the right teachers, the right coaches, the right volunteers who are involved with children right across the board.
OK, we'll have to stop there because unfortunately we've run out of time. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia from London with me, Tim Walklate. Today we've been discussing whether state school children are disadvantaged when it comes to sport. Joining me in the studio was Dr. Adrian Elliott, a retired head teacher of a state secondary school in York in the north of England, and he's also worked as a school inspector and as an advisor to schools, having written several books on education. Mihir Bose, one of Britain's leading sports journalists, and joining us on the phone was John Pettit, a former PE teacher and current director of PE recruitment, and Dr. Jean Key, chair of the Board of Association for Physical Education. The news is up next. Studio by Dr. Adrian Elliott, a retired head teacher of a state secondary school in York in the north of England, and he's also worked as a school inspector and as an advisor to schools, having written several books on education. And also Mihir Bose, one of Britain's leading sports journalists. And joining us on the phone is John Pettit, a former PE teacher and current director of PE recruitment, and Dr. Jean Key, chair of the Board of Association for Physical Education. Thank you all for coming. I'd first like to ask you all very briefly, are state school children disadvantaged when it comes to sport? Dr. Adrian Elliott.
I think inevitably they are, because in terms of facilities and the money available, I think there is more money.
Enough sport in school. And recently it emerged that the current government has given its approval for the vast majority of applications for the sale of 21 school playing fields. Prime Minister David Cameron has said that £1 billion will be invested in school sports over the next 4 years, but urged teachers to encourage their students to be more competitive in sport and end an all-must-have prizes culture in Britain. A draft new curriculum will be released this autumn, requiring the compulsory participation of primary school students in sports such as football, hockey and netball. Meanwhile, Lord Moynihan, the chairman of the British Olympic Association, said that it was wholly unacceptable that more than half of Team GB's medalists at the Beijing Olympics came from independent schools. Only 7% of children in the country are privately educated. I'm joined in the You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Walklate, and in today's discussion I'm looking at the legacy of the London Olympics. Team GB won 29 gold medals, beaten only by China and the USA. Branded a massive success, they've prompted calls from all sides to make sure that Britain capitalises on the wave of enthusiasm sweeping the nation. But in the light of remarks by the Prime Minister urging state schools to take a lead in promoting sport among the young, we ask, are state school children disadvantaged when it comes to sport? Questions are being asked over whether children are doing
in the average independent school, and obviously the facilities tend to be better. So I think in that sense that there clearly is a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious from the Olympic performances. If you look at Beijing, 50% of Britain's gold medals came from the private sector, which educates 7% of the children in this country. The ratio is slightly better for this. The final figures haven't come out. But, nevertheless, it's quite clear school playing fields have been sold out over many years. And basically, we still have a hangover of the philosophy that was propounded in the late 70s and 80s, which said that competitive sport is a bad thing. And as somebody once said, competitive sport led to the Battle of the Somme. Ridiculous statements like that. So, that hangover, though, while that philosophy, if you like, and this Olympics has proved, nobody would advance that argument now, but that philosophy is gone. The hangover of that, I think, still remains. And of course, it didn't affect the private schools as much as it affected the state schools.
And Dr. Jean Key?
I think we have to look at this in a slightly different way and look at who goes to state school and who goes to private school. Inevitably, children who go to private school, independent schools, are at an advantage in some ways because they will have parents who are very much concerned about their education. That's not to say that state school parents are not concerned, but they probably have a little bit more disposable income, which enables them to engage in lots of different activities outside school